Hello, welcome. This week we are going to be talking about imperfect competition. We're going to be starting with monopolies, which is the opposite of perfect competition, and then we're going to talk about some structures in between, like oligopoly and monopolistic competition. We're going to split this into three market structures, four if you count perfect competition. So, monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition. Your book also mentions duopoly, which is just a special case of oligopoly. We're not going to separate that out into its own separate thing. We're going to count it as part of oligopoly. We'll look at market power, the market profit maximizing rule, which will be similar but slightly different. We're going to get a marginal revenue curve that's downward sloping, and we're going to talk about price discrimination. So, imperfect competition is anytime you have a limited number of firms, some kind of product differentiation, anytime that one of those five conditions of perfect competition is different. So, if you remember from last week, we had like many firms, lots of sellers. They're selling identical products. There's free entry and exit into the market, so there's no barriers to entry. Full information, and then negligible transaction costs. So those are in the slides from last week if you want to go look at those again. But anytime one of these things is different, it's not the case, then we're going to say that it would be imperfect competition. And full information, negligible transaction costs, we'll talk about some of those scenarios. But typically it's going to be in one of these other three. So lots of sellers, maybe there's only one or two sellers, identical products. So for like anything you think of with a brand name, Coke, Pepsi, Delta Airlines, Apple Phone, Cheerios. They might have a lot of competitors, a lot of different substitutes, but they're not selling exactly the same thing. And then barriers to entering the market. So typically, those are going to be the three main contributors that are causing these markets to not act as perfect competition. So we're going to get into all of that today, or at least this week. I'm going to do it all today. You probably are not. Okay, so taxi medallion system, utilities, pharmaceuticals. These are going to be some markets where we have pretty high barriers to entry or maybe a limited number of firms. We'll get into a lot more examples as well. The taxi medallion system, this is really interesting because prior to Uber and Lyft and ride sharing services, there were a lot of restrictions on entering the market. It was very hard to start your own taxi company. If you wanted to become a taxi driver, you would have to buy a license or what's called a taxi medallion from a current owner, somebody who's trying to get out of the game. And sometimes those would be extremely expensive. You may be spending 100, 200, $300,000 just to buy the right to drive this taxi. And while people didn't like spending that much money, they were fine with it because it's a limited system. So when they decide to retire, they can then sell their taxi medallion to someone else. Uber came in and sort of disrupted this whole market and said, "Oh, well, we're not a taxi company. We're a ride sharing company, or we're a software company. We're just facilitating rides." There's some interesting documentaries online, some of the streaming services. If you're interested in this, highly recommend digging more into Uber and how it sort of disrupted this very heavily market that had very heavy barriers to entry. Utilities are going to be most effective when they're provided by one company. So think of like electricity. There's really high fixed costs, lots of infrastructure involved. You have to have poles and wires going to all the houses, and having competing firms is just going to increase the cost to deliver electricity. So it's going to be most effective when there's like one company providing it. Pharmaceuticals, medications, vaccines, sometimes they go into chemicals, all sorts of other development. They're really expensive to develop, and most of what they try to develop never turns into anything. So there's this really high cost to develop new medications, new drugs, new treatments, and there's going to be legal restrictions, so patents and copyrights that make it so that if you develop something, the pharmaceutical company develops something, they can have the exclusive right to produce and sell that thing for a certain amount of time to recover all of their investment efforts. And there's going to be different levels of imperfect competition. So pure monopoly is going to be the least competitive. So pure monopoly is where there's only one company, one provider of that thing. Other stuff we see here: taxis, utilities, pharmaceuticals. There actually may be multiple companies providing these things. Even in the utility space, you can purchase solar. So there's some solar companies that install things on houses, which would be, some level of competition for utilities. Pharmaceuticals, there's lots of pharmaceutical companies. It may be when you're looking at one particular medication, there could be a monopoly for that only medication. No one else has any sort of substitute. So we'll get into all of those details this week. So pure monopoly, one firm, no close substitutes, and high barriers to entry. An oligopoly is a small number of large firms. So it can be 2 companies making this, 3 or 4 companies, could be 10 companies. It depends on what type of market you're talking about. But there are going to be barriers to entry for small companies. It's going to be really hard to jump in unless you can start as a huge company. Typically, this happens when there are really high fixed costs to entry, and economies of scale makes it better to be like a large company. Products can be different or they can be perfect substitutes. So there are limitations in competition. There's limited number of production, and so they're able to charge a higher price even if they're selling an identical product to the other company. And then monopolistic competition. This is probably the closest to perfect competition. So I'll put perfect competition down here. Perfect competition. And then here you see we have our spectrum right here. So pure monopoly is least competitive, and perfect competition is most competitive. And then monopolistic competition is a little bit less competitive. Oligopoly is a little bit less competitive, and then pure monopoly is not at all competitive. Okay, so we see this range here, and depending on a whole bunch of factors, we'll talk about like why it makes it more or less competitive, and how that is going to impact consumers, consumer surplus, the economy overall, and market power. This is going to be one of the key distinguishers between perfect and imperfect competition. Market power means that our firms no longer are price takers. They can raise prices without losing all of their market share. So if you remember way back last week when we looked at perfect competition, we're going to have a market that has our normal supply and demand curves. But each individual firm, because they're such a small part of the market, they get stuck taking whatever this market price is, and that becomes a horizontal demand curve at the price. That's going to give them constant marginal revenue. It doesn't matter how much they sell up or down, they're going to get that same price per unit. When we have a monopoly, they just actually get to be the whole market. They don't have to worry about competing with anyone else. And while they are still limited by the demand curve, if they decided to reduce production, then they'll be able to charge a higher price without losing all of their market share. It's still going to follow the regular rules of demand where prices go up and that quantity demanded is going to go down. They're going to have less customers, less total sales, but because they're able to control both the price and quantity, they can actually pick the spot that gives them the highest profit. And so companies in imperfect competition, especially if they're monopoly, they're going to be able to maximize profits and have more profit than if they were in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so where do you get market power from? Okay, so market power basically means there's less competition. You're able to keep your customers even if you raise some prices. So this can come from things like exclusive control over inputs. So the landowner, the government, whoever is able to control that natural resource, especially if it is something that is not easy to get elsewhere. So sometimes you're trying to purchase something for your business and there's only one place you can get that from. One place you can get that natural resource. Maybe it's an ingredient for something you're producing. Um, but if whoever owns that gets control over it, right? They can charge the prices. Patents and copyrights are one of the more common ways that companies get market power. And we saw that this actually can happen in perfectly competitive markets as well. However, there's not as high of incentives to develop some of these things in perfectly competitive markets because the ability to make a lot of profit often just is not there. Also, there just aren't a lot of perfectly competitive markets because if you remember, it requires identical products. And oftentimes, when someone is patenting, can't say that word, patenting, getting a patent on something, it's because they've developed a new product, a new process, something new, and it's not going to be identical anymore. Sometimes this happens through government licenses. The government is going to limit who can enter the market. There are actual benefits for this for the economy, especially when you're considering like utility companies or other companies where you want to have one firm, going to get the best cost benefits. Maybe there's other political reasons they may want to limit competition, especially if the competition is global. They may limit it to domestic production, but they're going to do this uh, sometimes actually to make markets more efficient. So governments can create legal monopolies, and if they limit prices to competitive levels, they can still end up with efficient outcomes. Sometimes this is going to be through a natural monopoly. This is any industry that has really high startup costs or unique inputs. Sometimes utility companies are considered natural monopolies because it would be very expensive to create a competing utility company. Economies of scale. So anywhere increasing production is going to decrease average cost. We'll see this a little bit later, but they'll if this is our average cost function, say average total cost. And to be down here on the lower cost area, you may have to be a really big firm. You have to produce a large quantity. And so smaller companies want to compete, they can't because when the small company enters, they're making a small quantity and the small quantities have higher cost of production. So we're going to see economies of scale. That happens sometimes with a natural monopoly as well or government licenses. So you'll see some of these things may apply to multiple of these things may apply to one particular company or industry. Network economies, this increases in value as something gains more users. So think of like social media, texting, anything where you need other people to also be doing it for it to be valuable. Imagine you were the only person who could send or receive a text. Not super valuable. You probably wouldn't want to pay for that feature. But with everybody able to text, especially now with unlimited texting, it makes it extremely valuable. Social media, they need to have a lot of users for it to be valuable, and they're going to make it free for users. You do not have to pay for a Facebook account or a TikTok account. At least at the time I'm recording this, you did not. Why? Well, they're going to make money through advertising and other ways, and the way to get that revenue up is by having as many users as possible. So you're going to see things that need huge amount of users to often offer things for free. You can even see this in things like Windows or Microsoft Office, some of the software. Uh, Way back in my day, back in the Stone Age, no, you used to get computers and they would come preloaded with software. And for a long time, a lot of this was free. Like, get free copy of Microsoft Office when you buy this laptop. And it wasn't because it was free to produce. They just needed enough people using it that now they could start charging for it. So now Microsoft Office is not free and they've switched to subscription models. So you have to pay every month to keep using it. But a lot of people are like, well, I have to because I use it for my job or I use it for my friends or family or I use it for school. And so because so many people use it, it becomes necessary. Same thing with like Adobe Acrobat, other, and other types of software. And one important difference between perfect and imperfect competition is that economic profit can now be positive in the long run. So perfect competition, we could have temporary economic profit, and in the long run, it would go to zero. With imperfect competition, we can have positive economic profit in the long run. Okay, so we're going to start with pure monopoly. This is one supplier of a unique product with no close substitute. And this is where I think students sometimes get confused or really want to argue for something being a monopoly when it isn't. So you have to think about like what counts as a close substitute. So someone the other day was talking to me about Apple products. They said Apple iPhone is a monopoly. They have such a huge market share. They are able to charge whatever they want. They don't lose customers. They had a whole bunch of reasons and arguments. And while sort of, right, a monopoly in the sense that Apple is the only company that can manufacture and sell the iPhone, it wouldn't actually count as a pure monopoly because there are a lot of substitutes. You can switch to Samsung, get a Pixel phone, Google has stuff, LG, like there are tons and tons of substitutes. And if Apple's prices are high enough, they could potentially lose all of their customers to other suppliers. And all monopolies are still limited by the demand curve. So like this, let's say this is the demand for iPhones. There's still some highest price that people would be willing to pay. I don't know what that highest price is. Let's just put it at $10,000. There might be one person willing to pay $999. But once you get to 10, they're not going to have any customers anymore. There's no substitute. Other things that would be actually a pure monopoly would be potentially the post office, the U.S. Post Office. And not for delivering packages, but for delivering mail. The U.S. Post Office is the only entity that is legally allowed to deliver regular letters and mail to households every day. There are some substitutes. Potentially, you can send a letter through FedEx, but you have to basically treat it as a package. It's very, cost ineffective. People are not going to use that. And if FedEx found a way to do it cheaper and deliver to every house every day, the government would probably shut them down. So the US Post Office has a legal monopoly. And if the government ever just took that regulation off and said it doesn't have to be done through the post office, there potentially could be more competitors. So you may think like, okay, there's only one company that makes pink pineapples or only one company that makes this specialized type of shoe. But you really want to think if this is a pure monopoly, there have to be no close substitutes. There can't be something else that someone could use instead. To be a pure monopoly, there need to be significant barriers to entry, something significantly preventing competition. So, typically something legal or access to the resources or inputs needed for production. Monopoly power oftentimes happens because of economies of scale, patents of copyrights, ownership of unique inputs, government licensing and restrictions. And interestingly enough, though, pure monopolies are going to be rare. There is a high deadweight loss, a high social cost. And so oftentimes pure monopolies are illegal. So pure monopoly potentially could be illegal. Okay. If a company gets too big, or the government thinks they have too much power or they're moving more in that monopoly direction, oftentimes they will come break up that company. The DOJ will sue the company. DOJ sued Ticketmaster, or in California, there used to be one phone company that way before cell phones was, like landlines, and they had to break up into like 8 or 9 smaller companies. So if that deadweight loss, that social cost becomes too high, the government will step in and say, hey, you can't be this big company. It gets really interesting though when you start looking into mergers. A lot of times companies will buy up smaller companies, they'll buy up other industries, grocery stores try to merge, or tech companies, and they have to go through this process that says we're not going to be too big in the market that we can destroy everyone else and be the sole provider of this good or service. So we can think of a lot of things that maybe operate like monopolies. They may have a lot of market power. Sometimes people will talk about market share. So when they say market share, that would be like the percentage of the customers that one company has. And this is not just like everybody likes one thing. So if for some reason we all just liked iPhones better and everybody switched, moved off of their iPhones, and we moved off of everything else, no one bought Samsung, Pixel, or any of those other things, and everybody moved to iPhone, it wouldn't necessarily make it an illegal monopoly. So customers don't have to buy different things. It just has to be possible for other companies to come in and be competitive. Later, we'll talk about product differentiation. So there's a reason that probably won't happen. iPhones, let's say iPhone and Samsung. Personally, right now, I'm a Samsung person. I used to have some MacBook stuff, and if you would like to come talk to me, we can get to some of those reasons. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, but Samsung just tends to work better for my personal uses. But here's the thing, they make them operate differently. So if I need to figure out how to use an iPhone, I absolutely can. But generally, like, I don't know, my Samsung has like a lot of buttons, and I can right click on things and I can download stuff and do things. And my mom was having some issues with her phone. She has an iPhone, and she's like, "How do you fix this? How do I get into the security setting?" I'm like, "I have no idea. You have one button. I don't know how to use this." And so they purposely make it so that these experiences are different enough that it makes it harder for you to switch. So even if I felt like maybe iPhones were better, I would have to get over that barrier of now I have to learn how to use this new thing. And so there's ways that companies do stuff to keep themselves competitive. Public policy and natural monopolies, these both sort of have to do with economies of scale and maximizing that total production and keeping those lowest possible costs. So oftentimes natural monopolies are going to be most efficient, most cost efficient when there's one provider. You could see on this graph right here, we have our long run average cost curve. And if you remember back from our economies of scale chapter, right here we've got increasing returns to scale. And then down here, it's constant returns to scale. And then over here, we go up into the decreasing returns to scale. And so in this case, here's our demand curve. Oh, that's demand. Here's increasing returns to scale. And our demand curve is hitting it sort of at this increasing level. It hasn't quite got down to the constant portion of the line. And what this means is really that we can only have one company. Looks like this is at about 5,000 output. And the reason that we can only have one company here is that, let's say we split this up into two smaller companies that were each making 2,500. That's going to have some higher costs over here. I should have made this much bigger. Hold on. Let me see if I can make this. Okay, so here's our long run average cost curve. And then this one right here is demand. Okay, so if we have two companies, let's say they're half, 2,500 each, they're going to have these much higher costs of production, right? Average cost is going to be a lot higher. And so another new company can't join the market. They're not going to be competitive because they're going to charge more than the current monopoly, right? And so economies of scale just naturally limit competition. No one's going to want to join this market unless they find a way to get people to want to pay more. So sometimes governments are going to intervene because they want to increase economic surplus. A little bit later, we're going to talk about deadweight loss from monopolies and how these markets do cause lower levels of production than what would happen in a purely competitive market. And so governments might intervene. They may decide they want to own this thing. So the government owns the post office. They may set some regulations where they say your price has to equal average total cost, which is what would happen in a competitive market. They may set up a bidding system for provision of services. So the city where I live has one trash provider, but they don't want to have them charge high prices because of no competition. So what the city does is they say, okay, we're going to have a bidding system. We're going to make a contract, maybe for 3 years, 5 years, however long. We'll say we're going to have a 3-year contract for trash services. And companies can submit a proposal for services saying, we will charge this much money, XYZ dollars. We'll do this amount of services. Here's the cost to the city. Here's the cost to residents. And then the idea is that whoever puts in the lowest bid, or sometimes they take the second lowest bid, there's different rules for that, gets the contract. So that way they still have to be competitive. They're competing with other people to offer low enough prices to get the contract, but then they're operating as just one company to be able to benefit from those low average total costs. And we won't get into too much about bidding systems and some of these other things. If you're interested in it, please come talk to me. I did work at a government agency before, and we did have some bidding and some of this other stuff. I've worked for private companies and schools and government. So if you're interested in how any of this stuff works more, please come talk to me. We assume that there are significant barriers to entry. So, monopoly and perfect competition, there has to be something restricting people from joining. So, a natural monopoly, the government may do nothing or they may respond by regulating the market or owning the market. So, example would be water and electric companies. It may be because somebody owns or controls a physical resource. The government may or may not do anything. They sometimes they'll say something, but often it's like, well, somebody owns that resource. We're not going to do anything. An example would be De Beers. They own like most of the diamonds in the world. There could be a legal monopoly. So this would be yes, the government says we're going to allow this monopoly to exist. It could be through government ownership. Could be through regulations. So things like the post office or regulating airlines and trucking. It could be through a patent, trademark, or copyright. This is a legal process to protect intellectual property and allow people to temporarily benefit off of their innovation. Things like new drugs, software, anytime you're inventing something. Sometimes there's a barrier to entry because someone's intimidating potential customers. Sometimes the government will step in and do something, saying no, you cannot do that. That's illegal. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes we see this through predatory pricing, well-known brand names. Sometimes we'll see some industries will charge prices that are too low to kick everyone else out of the market. They'll take a short-term loss so they could become the only provider. And we will get into some of those things in later slides. Okay, we're going to pause here and then I'm going to stop this and start a new video where we get into demand and marginal revenue and profit maximization.